Well, just a few weeks ago, the nation appeared shocked at the official unemployment number reported by Stats SA for the second quarter. Official data put the figure at 29%. When taking into account those who've given up looking for work, that is discouraged workers, that rate goes up to 38.5%. In number terms, that's some 10.2 million people that are unemployed. The fact of the matter is that South Africa's unemployment rate has been in crisis territory for many years. Any solutions to try and deal with this structural problem appear to have failed, as previously mentioned by our guests, Zwelinzima Vavi and the former Statistician General Pali Lehohla. So do we need a new normal in dealing with this scourge? Well, I'm joined in studio by Professor Steven Friedman. He's from the University of Johannesburg. Thanks very much, Professor, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Good stuff. So you've pretty much concluded, and I suppose it's also evidence that this economy is just unable to create sufficient jobs for new entrants coming in and even existing, people of working age. It just doesn't seem to be able to manage that. Why historically do you think that's been the case?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the figures, you'll see that really unemployment started growing substantially in the early 1970s, and the trend has persisted up until now. So, when we get upset about 29%, as we should, we need to remember that in 2003, when people felt the economy was doing well, the figure was 31%, also on the narrow definition. So really, we haven't been creating these jobs for a very long time. The reason has to do with, in effect, the apartheid economy. And in 1994, we changed our political system. We didn't really change our economy. We are still operating with a highly concentrated economy, which is very difficult to get into. So the emphasis in the economy for a very long time has been on large corporates who tend to follow the technological trends internationally, so that when they can shed labor, they can.
Yes.
And therefore, in that space in the economy, which is where we're all expected to look, there just is very limited opportunities for job creation. I mean, one of the crudest frauds, in effect, one hesitates to use the word, is the jobs debate we have in the country at the moment, in which some people claim they're going to create 8 million and some people 6 million, whatever the figure may be. I think we need to accept the reality that not only have we inherited an economy which can't control jobs, can't create jobs, we are living in a world in which those kind of jobs are dying out.
Yeah.
So really, this idea that somehow we can close our eyes and go back to 1960s is just not going to happen. And what we need to do is think differently. And the first way we need to think differently is we need to think less about jobs and we need to think more about livelihoods. A livelihood gets you the income that a job gets you, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're sitting in the formal economy in some sort of glass and concrete building.
So what does that mean? Does that mean eking out a living? Does that mean subsistence type of living? Does it mean that everyone basically needs to start thinking in an entrepreneurial fashion? Is everyone tuned to be an entrepreneur?
Everybody is thinking in if you talk about people in townships and shack settlements, they are thinking in a very entrepreneurial fashion, because quite frankly, they wouldn't be able to survive if they didn't think it. I mean, people would die of starvation if they didn't think of it in an entrepreneurial fashion. What we have to do is start thinking of ways. I mean, you're absolutely correct. In a lot of ways at the moment, that does mean eking out a living at the margin. But it doesn't have to mean eking out a living at the margin. It can actually mean being very productive, feeding yourself and your family, and also contributing to the economy.
Yes.
And in order to do that, we have to accept that that kind of economic activity is not only legitimate, but that it needs to be celebrated. I mean, at the moment, those people in the townships I mentioned who are doing this, they are regarded as problems. They should be regarded as potential solutions.
Yes.
And they need to be hooked up with the formal economy. They need to be provided with decent infrastructure.
That's right.
They need to be protected from crime. Not in the way in which, we've seen in the Johannesburg inner city, that in a sense they've had crime imposed on them. People who we should be respecting, people who we should be encouraging, are being vilified. This has been going on for decades. I mean, you speak to traders' associations in the middle of Johannesburg, and they'll tell you that most of the time they're dodging the police when they should be selling goods.
Professor, what about the issue of education? I mean, what you're talking about is what you can do now. If you're unemployed now, obviously try and make a plan, try and hustle. But long term, the educational outcomes in South Africa, they haven't been great. And yet the South African government spends way more proportionally on education than other middle income countries. So something's going wrong there. What needs to be done in that regard so that going forward, we're not only worried about eking out a living, but being able to compete with the guys in South Korea and the West and so on?
No, that's true. Look, education is not efficient and it is a problem. Although I must stress that we tend to assume in this country that it's some kind of panacea, it's some kind of magic bullet. It helps, but if you just look at Zimbabwe, for example, I mean, Zimbabwe had this absolute explosion in education, but because the other things weren't fixed, it didn't lead to the benefits. So it's not the only thing we have to fix. But if we want to start fixing education, we really have to start, I mean, it sounds like a trendy cliche, but it's absolutely true. We have to start empowering parents. And at the moment, the most effective guarantee of a decent education for a child is parents who actually have a say. We have huge problems in this country with broken families, etc. But still, there's a lot of research evidence to show that parents who do show an interest in the equivalent, people who are living in poverty, who show an interest in education, tend to get fobbed off by the teachers, etc. That has to change. We have to make school governing bodies work in a way in which they really give parents a voice. And that is one way in which we can start to deal with this problem.
One last thing, Professor, is government doing enough? I know we're always reaching out to government, but obviously if its interventions can have a catalytic impact.
No, government is not doing enough in a lot of ways. I mean, first of all, when I say that we're going to have to empower and support people engaged in formal activity, that is essentially a government responsibility. A lot of it is a government responsibility. Make sure that people aren't harassed, make sure that there are decent facilities, etc. On the other hand, government is also going to have to take the lead in getting us all to think differently about this issue. So government should be going to formal business and saying, what are you prepared to contribute to this process? What are you prepared to do? Because remember at the moment that a lot of the rules which restrict people in informal business are imposed because formal business wants them, because they don't want the competition.
That's right.
Formal business has to accept that if we're going to have a growing economy, if somebody's on the pavement outside your office selling goods, they need to be encouraged. They need not to be suppressed. But government has a key role in that.
Professor, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for your insights. That was Professor Steven Friedman. He's from the University of Johannesburg.